I'd been following him for 3 years of my life. And I'd left everything to follow Jesus. He was my Lord, my master, my best friend. And I loved him dearly. And if there was one person on the face of the earth who thought that they would never fail Jesus, that they'd never let him down, that they'd always be there for him, that person was me. Or at least that's what I sincerely believed until the night in question I'm about to tell you about. Now, last week I began to explain to you how we as the disciples, along with Jesus, were celebrating the Last Supper in the upper room. And while we were eating, Jesus had said to Judas, "What you are about to do it quickly." And Judas had left the upper room. Now, we had no idea that Jesus was talking about the betrayal of Judas because Judas was in charge of the money bags. He was in charge of the finances. So we thought Jesus was telling Judas to go buy more food for the feast or to give some of the money to the poor, as was our custom at the time of the Passover. And so Jesus had left the meal. We carried on eating with Jesus and we sung a hymn. And then we went out onto the Mount of Olives. And as we were walking along the Mount of Olives, Jesus turned to all of us and said, "You will all fall away. For it is written, I will strike the shepherd, and the sheep will be scattered." Now, Jesus was quoting from the prophet Zechariah, who 400 years earlier had predicted that a time would come when the Messiah, whom he described as the shepherd, would be struck, would be mistreated, would be abused. And his followers, whom he described as the sheep, us as the disciples, would all scatter. You're saying that that's about to be fulfilled tonight. Being the person that I was, having the type of character that I was very often not slow. I was not slow to speak. And I blurted out my words, and I said to Jesus, "Even if all fall away, I will not." Yes, I can understand James and John and even my brother Andrew. They're quite weak men at times. They might fall away, but I'll never fall away, Jesus. Jesus looked at me with such love in his eyes, and he said, "I tell you the truth, Peter. Today, yes, tonight, before the rooster crows twice, you yourself will disown me 3 times." I was deeply saddened. I was devastated by these words. I mean, didn't Jesus know how much I loved him? Didn't he know I'd left everything to follow him? And after all, Jesus had changed my name from Simon to Peter, the rock, the brave one. I'm going to let him down. I said, "Jesus," I insisted emphatically. I said, "Even if I have to die with you, I will never disown you." Mind you, all other of the 10 disciples said exactly the same thing. They were ready to die with Jesus that night. We carried walking along the Mount of Olives. We came to a place known as the Garden of Gethsemane. And Jesus said to us, as all of the disciples, he said, "Sit here while I go and pray." But he took myself, James and John, the sons of Zebedee, the sons of thunder. He took us along, the 3 of us. We were the inner circle, the 3 men on this earth that Jesus entrusted himself the most to. It's not that he loved us more than the other disciples, but he revealed more of himself to us. We were there on the Mount of Transfiguration when Jesus was transfigured before our very eyes. We were there, for example, when Jesus had raised Jairus' daughter from death. We were his closest companions, his closest friends, and if ever he needed us, it was that night. He said, "Stay here and keep watch." All he wanted us to do was to keep watch, was to stay alert, was to pray for what was about to happen that night, for what was going to come our way. Jesus went a little bit farther on, about a stone's throw away, and he fell to his knees. It's as though his knees couldn't even carry him. Before he actually did this, he had actually said to us that his soul was overwhelmed with sorrow to the point of death. I'd never seen Jesus look this deeply distressed and troubled in my life, but now he went to pray to the Father. He fell to his knees. And this wasn't any ordinary prayer that he prayed that night. It was a prayer of desperation. It was an agonizing prayer. It was a prayer with loud cries and tears to his Father, to the one who could save him from death. So desperate was this prayer that he began to drop sweat sweat drops of blood, indicating overwhelming sorrow and agony that he was going through. He prayed that if possible, the hour might pass from him. He said, Abba, Father. It was a term of a son to a father. Daddy, everything is possible for you. Take this cup from me. The cup in our Jewish thought, in our Tanakh, almost always referred to a terrible thing someone had to suffer, somebody had to endure, a terrible suffering. And what Jesus was about to endure was the worst suffering known to men. You see, he knew that within a matter of hours, he would experience the worst physical agony known to men. He would have his beard pulled from his cheeks. A crown of thorns would be placed on his head. His back would be scourged. He'd have nails driven through his hands and his feet. But it was far more than that. Friends, many of the early disciples went to their death as martyrs. Many of them were crucified and they went to their death joyfully, singing. It was more than that. For Jesus knew that within a matter of hours, the sin of the entire world would be placed upon his shoulders. I know just myself, my sin being laid upon him and suffering the penalty for my sin must have been too terrible to bear. Now imagine the sin of billions being laid upon you as the sin-bearing substitute. And he knew that at that moment, the Father would turn his face away as his Son bears the sin of the world. In a very real sense, Jesus would experience hell on that cross for a brief period of time. And it was as though it was too much for him to bear. It was though in his humanity he was saying, Father, if there's any other way, if there's any other way to accomplish redemption, to pay for the sins of men, then please let it be. But ultimately he knew there was no other way. For this was the plan that he and the Father had made before the creation of the world. And so he ended his prayer with one final sentence. Yet not my will, but yours be done. You know, the first Adam in the Garden of Eden, when faced with a temptation, essentially said to God, he said, not your will, but mine be done. Jesus, the second Adam, in the Garden of Gethsemane, when faced with a far greater trial, said to the Father, not your will, not my will, but yours be done. Our friends, don't ever overlook the magnitude of this moment in the garden. For if Jesus had walked away at that point, every one of us would be without life and without hope and without peace. But because of his love for us, and even more importantly, because of his love for his Father and his desire to always do his will, he said, not my will, but yours be done. And because of that, we have hope and life and peace and healing. Jesus returned after his prayer to us as the disciples. And what did he ask us to do? To stay alert, to pray. What happened? We'd fallen asleep. Jesus woke me up. He said, Simon, are you sleeping? Could you not keep watch for 1 hour? Watch and pray so that you do not fall into temptation. The spirit is willing, but the body is weak. The flesh is weak. He knew that deep down we wanted to do the right thing. We wanted to be there for him. But our flesh was fighting against us. And instead of praying, instead of calling out to the Father for strength for what was coming that night, we fell asleep. You know what our problem was? We thought we were far stronger than we really were. We should have recognized our weakness and how much we needed God to help us that night. Jesus went away a second time to pray, prayed the exact same thing. And he came back a second time to us. And what did he find? He found us sleeping once again because our eyes were heavy. He woke us up and we were ashamed. We felt so bad that we let him down a second time. Jesus went back one last time and he prayed, Father, take this cup from me, yet not my will, but yours be done. And he returned and we'd fallen asleep a third time. The hour of his greatest need, when he needed us the most, we'd already failed him that night 3 times when the heat wasn't even on, when the persecution hadn't even come yet. just as Jesus woke us up the third time, we heard the voices of a crowd of men coming towards us. We saw sort of torches in the night sky getting closer and closer. Jesus said to us, "Enough. The hour has come. Look, the Son of Man is betrayed into the hands of sinners. Rise, let us go. Here comes my betrayer." And who should come out of the shadows of the night, surrounded by a crowd of men, armed with swords and clubs, sent by the chief priests, the teachers of the law, and the elders? But Judas himself. Judas is there. What's he doing with this crowd of men? He should be with us as the disciples. And then it began to dawn on me that all along, when Jesus had said, "One of you will betray me," when he'd said to Judas, "What you're about to do it quickly," he'd been talking about his betrayal. We had no idea that Judas was the betrayer. He'd been with us for 3 years. He'd ministered with us. He was in charge of the money bag. We had no idea. But Judas ended up betraying his Lord for 30 pieces of silver. Out of greed, he sold him for the price of a slave. Now the betrayer, Judas, had arranged a signal with this crowd of men. He said to them, the man that I kiss is the man that you must arrest and lead underway under guard." Judas walked up to Jesus and he looked him in the face and he said, "Rabbi," and he kissed Jesus. In our time, in our culture, men would kiss one another as a greeting, as a form of love, as a form of affection. And Judas chose that greeting to betray his Lord. The men seized and arrested Jesus. They began to take him away, and I began to panic. This can't be happening. This is not the way it's supposed to play out. And I took my sword out and I sort of swung it towards the crowd of men, cutting off the ear of Malchus, a servant of the high priest. You know, Jesus, in the midst of this suffering that he was undergoing, in the midst of this arrest, you know what he does? Picks the ear up, puts it back on the man's head, and makes him whole, heals him, still wanting to do good for others, as his heart was always inclined to do. Jesus said to the crowd of men, he said, "Am I leading a rebellion that you come out with swords and clubs to capture me? Every day I was with you in the temple courts teaching you, and you did not arrest me. But the scriptures must be fulfilled." Yeah, Jesus had been teaching every day in the temple courts. They could have arrested him there, but they were afraid to do so because Jesus was popular with the crowds. They were afraid that a riot might break out, and so they did it at night, away from public view. But ultimately, Jesus knew that everything that was happening was in fulfillment of the scriptures, was fulfillment of the prophecies, right down to his very arrest. He knew it was meant to happen that way. He was no victim of circumstances. At that point, we all fled and deserted him. We scattered, fulfilling the words that Jesus had just said hours earlier, "You will all fall away on account of me." There was a young man there that night, following in the shadows, standing behind a tree, wearing nothing but a linen garment. When this crowd of men saw this young man, they tried to seize him, but this man managed to slip out of their grasp and leaving his linen garment behind, and he fled away into the night, naked. That man was a man that you know by the name of John Mark, a man who would go on to become a traveling companion of the Apostle Paul and Barnabas, a man who indeed would write one of the 4 Gospels, the Gospel of Mark. So they took Jesus away. They took him to the high priest. The high priest was a man by the name of Caiaphas. He had a residence in Jerusalem just outside the temple. They took him to the high priest. And all the chief priests and the elders and the teachers of the law came together. Meanwhile, I followed Jesus at a distance, out of sight, right into the courtyard of the high priest. It was very cold that night. There was a big fire that had been started. I sat around with the guards, warming myself at the fire. Meanwhile, inside the residence of Caiaphas, the chief priests and the whole Sanhedrin were looking for evidence against Jesus that they might put him to death. What's going on here? Why do you have the highest religious authorities in the land of Israel all gathered together on this night, this this night of the Passover. It wasn't supposed to happen. Why are they all there? It's very simple, friends. They wanted to get rid of Jesus. They were desperate to get rid of Jesus, for they hated him. They were jealous of him. They saw him as a threat to their authority. They saw him as a threat to their money-making schemes in the temple, and they wanted him out of the picture. And these men who were supposed to uphold justice, who were supposed to protect the law and do what was right and just and fair, would very shortly pervert justice in the most disgusting way. They began by looking for evidence against Jesus, that they might put him to death. But here's the problem. How do you find evidence against someone who's never done anything wrong? Who's never said anything wrong? Who's never done anything wrong? There's no dirt you're going to find on him. There's no skeletons in his closet. So they had to revert to lies. They had to revert to false testimony, something that God, Yahweh, hates. He hates false testimony given. But many testified falsely against Jesus. But their statements did not agree. Some stood up and gave this false testimony against them. They said, "We heard him say that he will destroy this temple in Jerusalem, this man-made temple, and in 3 days build another temple not made by the hands of men." Well, firstly, they were misquoting Jesus. Secondly, they completely misunderstood him. Jesus had never said, "I'm going to destroy this temple in Jerusalem." He had simply said, "Destroy this temple, and I will raise it again in 3 days." But of course, he was referring to his body, that he is the meeting place between God and men, and that 3 days later he would be raised to life after his death. They misquoted him, and they completely misunderstood him. But even then, their testimony did not line up. So there's no evidence against Jesus. The false testimony is not lining up. There was one thing left for them to do, and that was to get Jesus to commit blasphemy, or blasphemy at least as they thought. Caiaphas himself, the high priest, stood up in front of everybody, and he said to Jesus, what is this testimony these men are bringing against you? Are you not going to give an answer? And Jesus remained silent. He didn't need to answer. He didn't need to answer these false charges that were being brought against him. And in doing this, Jesus fulfilled the words of the prophet Isaiah, who 700 years earlier had said that the Messiah would be led like a lamb to the slaughter, and as a sheep before her shearers is silent, so he would not open his mouth. Finally, Caiaphas essentially put Jesus under oath. He bound him with an oath. He said, "Are you the Christ, the Son of the Blessed One?" Jesus knew that by answering this question, he was essentially signing his death warrant. He said, "I am. And you will see the Son of Man seated at the right hand of the Mighty One and coming on the clouds of heaven." And in doing this, Jesus was quoting from the prophet Daniel, who hundreds of years earlier had had a vision of one like a Son of Man being ushered into the presence of the Ancient of Days, the presence of God Almighty himself. And this Son of Man figure was given power and authority, and all the nations of the earth worshipped him as God. And Jesus was essentially saying, that person that Daniel saw, that Son of Man, it's me. I am God himself. Caiaphas tore his clothes in anger and righteous indignation. He said, "You have heard the blasphemy. Why do we need any more witnesses? What do you think?" Every single person there that night condemned him as worthy of death. Isn't that incredible? The ones who themselves were worthy of death, condemning the only one in that room who was innocent. And then some of them, they struck him, they blindfolded him, they spat on him. And the guards took him and they beat him mercilessly, and they said, "Prophesy, Christ, who hit you?" Jesus had truly begun to drink the cup of suffering. Meanwhile, outside in the courtyard, a servant girl of the high priest came past me. She kind of looked at me, then she looked back. She looked more closely at me. She said, "You were with the Nazarene, Jesus." I denied it. I said, I don't understand what you're talking about, man. I kind of went somewhere else in the courtyard in the entryway. Another servant girl came past and said, to the crowd that was standing around, he's one of them. And I denied it again. I denied it a second time. Then a little bit later on, the crowd that was standing around said to me, but surely you are one of them, for you are a Galilean. You see, my accent gave it away. The way I pronounced my words, it showed that I was from the north, where Jesus was from. It says, you're a Galilean. You're one of them. I began to call down curses on myself. I took an oath. I was essentially saying that God can strike me dead if I'm lying to you. I said, I don't know the man. I don't know him. At that very moment, the rooster crowed the second time. And I remembered the words Jesus had said just hours earlier. Tonight, Peter, you will disown me 3 times. And I went outside of the courtyard and I broke down and I wept bitterly. I've never wept like that before, and I've never wept like that since. I'd failed my Lord over and over and over that night. And friends, you know what I learned that night about myself and about Jesus, and in the days and the weeks and the months that lay ahead? I learned this firstly about myself. I learned that I'm not as strong as I thought I was, that I fail at times, that I let Jesus down, that I make mistakes, that I was far weaker than I really thought I was. But I also learned this about Jesus, that there's only one hero of the story. There's only one who always did the will of the Father perfectly. And you know, in the days and the weeks and the months that lay ahead, after I had repented, Jesus forgave me gladly, and he restored me as the leader of the early church, in spite of how I'd failed him over and over and over that night, showing himself to be a God of grace and mercy and a God of second chances. And what he did for me that night, he can and will do for you too. Amen.